March 17th, 1848, St. Patrick's Day. While Ireland mourned its dying people, Workhouse Inspector Thomas Bellingham descended into the coal cellar beneath the Mountmellick Union Workhouse in County Laois. He'd come to investigate complaints about strange sounds emanating from below the fever wards. What he expected to find was perhaps a broken ventilation shaft, maybe evidence of rats in the foundation. What he found instead was a sow, a massive, pregnant pig, living in a makeshift pen surrounded by 12 human bodies in various stages of decomposition. The pig had given birth 3 days earlier. Her piglets were nursing among the corpses. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple case of neglect. Before we uncover the truth about the Laois workhouse sow and the conspiracy that turned dying fever victims into livestock feed, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We're bringing you the darkest, most forgotten chapters of history every week. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now let's descend into one of the Irish Famine's most buried secrets. Ireland, 1845 to 1852. The Great Hunger. Most know this period as a potato blight, a natural disaster that claimed over 1 million lives. But what history often glosses over is how deeply human decisions, not just natural catastrophe, determined who lived and who died. The workhouse system, introduced under the Irish Poor Law of 1838, was designed as Britain's answer to Irish poverty. These institutions were meant to provide relief, but they operated on a principle called less eligibility. Conditions inside had to be worse than the worst conditions outside, or else everyone would seek admission. By 1847, the system was collapsing under its own cruelty. The Mountmellick Union Workhouse, located in County Laois in central Ireland, was a grey stone fortress that loomed over the town like a prison. Built to house 800 souls, by the winter of 1847 it held over 2,400. The building's architect had designed it with segregation in mind. Men separated from women, children from parents, the elderly isolated in their own wards. But disease respects no walls. Typhus fever, what the Irish called famine fever or black fever, swept through workhouses like wildfire. The disease, spread by body lice, thrived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Victims suffered high fever, severe headaches, and a distinctive rash that turned dark as blood pooled under the skin. Delirium followed, then death, usually within 2 weeks. The Mountmellick Workhouse had its first typhus case in November 1847. By January 1848, the fever had claimed 143 lives. By February, the bodies were piling up faster than they could be buried. This is where our story truly begins, not with the disease itself, but with what the workhouse master, a man named Cornelius Dwyer, decided to do about it. Dwyer was 53 years old, a local merchant who'd secured the workhouse master position through political connections, rather than any expertise in poor relief. He was known in Mountmellick as a practical man, perhaps too practical, someone who viewed problems through the lens of accounting rather than humanity. His wife, Margaret, served as the matron, overseeing the female inmates, as the residents were called. Together, they ran the institution with an iron efficiency that impressed the Board of Guardians. At least, that's what the official report suggested. But by early 1848, whispers had begun circulating in Mountmellick's pubs and market squares. Families who'd placed dying relatives in the workhouse infirmary reported something disturbing. Their loved ones would disappear from the fever wards without notification. When they inquired, workhouse staff would claim the person had been transferred to the isolation ward for the protection of other inmates. But when these families came to visit, they'd be turned away. Contagion protocols, they were told. Board of Health regulations. When they asked to collect their relatives' bodies for burial, a sacred duty in Irish Catholic tradition, they'd be informed the person had already been interred in the workhouse cemetery, a pauper's grave, unmarked and unconsecrated. Something wasn't right. But in 1848 Ireland, with death everywhere and authority absolute, who would question the workhouse master? The first documented complaint came from Mary Delaney, a widow from Rosenallis, a village 6 miles from Mountmellick. On January 23, 1848, she'd brought her 16-year-old son, Patrick, to the workhouse. He was burning with fever, his body covered in the telltale rash. She'd had no choice, she couldn't afford a doctor, and the fever was contagious. Her 3 younger children needed protection. The admission clerk recorded Patrick's entry at 2:30 in the afternoon. He was taken to the male fever ward on the 2nd floor. 3 days later, Mary returned with a small bundle, clean clothes for Patrick, and a piece of salted pork she'd traded for at great personal cost. She wanted her son to have something substantial to eat, But the porter at the gate turned her away. "No visitors to the fever wards," he said. "Master's orders, new policy." Mary protested. "I've come every time any of my children have been sick here. I've always been allowed to bring food." The porter's response was memorized, scripted. Board of Health circular from Dublin. Typhus is more contagious than previously understood. Family contact increases transmission risk. It's for your own protection, Mrs. Mary left the pork with the porter, making him promise to deliver it to Patrick personally. She returned 4 days later, January 30th. She asked to see her son. The porter consulted with someone inside, then returned with different news. "Your boy Patrick has been transferred to the isolation ward. He's receiving specialized care. When can I see him? When he's recovered, Mrs. That's the protocol." Mary came back every day for the next week. Each time the same answer: isolation ward, recovering, protocol. On February 8th, 16 days after she'd admitted Patrick, Mary arrived to find a different porter at the gate, an older man she recognized from the village. When she asked about Patrick, he looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry for your trouble, Mrs.," he said. "The boy died 3 days back." The words hit Mary like a physical blow. 3 days? Why wasn't I notified? Where is he buried? I want to see him." The porter shook his head. "He's already in the ground, Mrs. Workhouse Cemetery. They can't delay with fever cases, contagion risk." Mary tried to push past him, but he caught her arm gently. "Please, Mrs., don't make trouble for yourself. These are hard times. Accept the will of God." But Mary Delaney didn't accept it. She went directly to Father Michael O'Brien, the parish priest of Mountmellick. Father O'Brien was 62 years old, a man who'd served his flock for 35 years. He'd buried hundreds during the famine, had seen suffering beyond description. But he still believed in the sanctity of death rituals, in a family's right to mourn their dead. He accompanied Mary to the workhouse the next day. They demanded to see Cornelius Dwyer. The workhouse master received them in his office, a wood-paneled room with a large desk covered in ledgers and correspondence. He was cordial but firm. "I understand your grief, Mrs. Delaney, but we're following Board of Health guidelines. Typhus bodies must be buried within 24 hours of death. We cannot make exceptions." "I wasn't even notified," Mary said, her voice breaking. "He was my only son." "We sent word to Rosenalice," Dwyer said, pulling out a ledger. "It's recorded here, February 5th, message delivered to Delaney household." "No one came to my door," Dwyer spread his hands. "Perhaps the messenger found no one home. Perhaps H.E. left word with a neighbor. I can't account for every detail of delivery, Mrs. Delaney. I'm sorry." Father O'Brien leaned forward. "Mr. Dwyer, I'm requesting to see the body. It's not too late to perform proper rites." "The body is buried, Father. Then we'll exhume it." Dwyer's expression hardened. "I cannot authorize that. The Board of Health explicitly forbids exhumation of fever victims. The risk of spreading disease The risk is minimal if proper precautions are taken," Father O'Brien interrupted. "I've buried dozens of fever victims with my own hands, Mr. Dwyer. I know the risks. Nevertheless, I cannot allow it. If you wish to appeal, you may write to the Board of Guardians. Good day." Father O'Brien wrote that letter the same afternoon. It would be 3 weeks before he received a response. A bureaucratic dismissal citing health regulations and wartime priorities. Britain was dealing with revolutions across Europe. Irish workhouse protocols were not a priority. But Father O'Brien's interest had been piqued. He began asking questions around Mountmellick. How many other families had similar experiences? The answer was disturbing. Dozens. Thomas Brennan had lost his wife Ellen in early February. Same pattern, admitted with fever, transferred to isolation, died without family notification, buried immediately. Catherine Murphy's father, 68-year-old James Murphy, had vanished from the workhouse in late January. When Catherine inquired, she was told he'd died and been buried, but the clerk couldn't tell her exactly when he'd died or where precisely he'd been buried in the cemetery. Michael Dunn's 14-year-old daughter, Bridget, Sean O'Connor's elderly mother, Nora, Patrick Flanagan's brother, Joseph, all the same pattern, all in January and February 1848, all admitted with fever, all transferred to the mysterious isolation ward, all buried without family present. Father O'Brien compiled a list, 19 names by mid-February. He brought his concerns to the Board of Guardians, the local committee that oversaw workhouse operations. The board consisted of local landlords, merchants, and ratepayers, men of property who met monthly to review workhouse finances and policies. At the February 18th meeting, Father O'Brien presented his findings. He was careful, diplomatic. He didn't accuse Dwyer of wrongdoing, merely requested clarification about the isolation ward protocols and burial procedures. The board chairman, Sir Richard Mountford, a local landlord, listened with apparent concern. He promised to investigate. "Though I'm certain Mr. Dwyer has been following all appropriate guidelines," he added. "He's been an exemplary workhouse master during this crisis." Cornelius Dwyer himself, present at the meeting as required, showed no concern whatsoever. He produced meticulous records, admission dates, death dates, burial locations. Everything appeared in order. "If families feel they weren't properly notified, I sympathize," he said. "But we're managing over 2,000 inmates with a skeleton staff. Some administrative oversights are inevitable." Father O'Brien wasn't satisfied, but he had no authority over the workhouse. He could only wait for the board's investigation. That investigation would never come, because on March 12, 1848, something happened that changed everything. A sow, a breeding pig owned by the workhouse and kept in a pen behind the main building, escaped. The animal was valuable, one of several pigs the workhouse raised to supplement food rations. The pig keeper, a man named Thomas Kelly, discovered the animal missing during his evening rounds. He searched the grounds, asking other staff if they'd seen the sow. No one had, but one of the fever ward nurses, a woman named Bridget Hayes, mentioned something odd. She'd heard grunting sounds coming from below the ward's floorboards earlier that day. She'd assumed it was pipes or ventilation, but now she wondered. Kelly grabbed a lantern and descended to the basement level. The workhouse's lower floor was a labyrinth of storage rooms, coal cellars, and abandoned spaces. The building had been constructed hastily, and its layout was illogical. Rooms that led nowhere, bricked-up doorways, spaces that seemed to exist between floors. Kelly followed the sounds, grunting, squealing. The smell hit him before he found the source. Not just pig, but something else, something rotten. He found a door he'd never noticed before, partially hidden behind stacked crates. The door was unlocked. Inside, the sow had made a nest in the corner of a coal cellar. She'd given birth. Kelly could see piglets nursing in the lantern light. But that wasn't what made him drop the lantern and run. Surrounding the pig's nest, arranged along the walls of the cellar, were bodies, human bodies, some fresh, some decomposing. 12 in total, Kelly would later testify, lying on the coal dust floor like discarded refuse. The pig had been eating them. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. What we're about to uncover next will shake your understanding of how far people will go to hide their sins. Let's discover what happens next. Thomas Kelly's screams brought 3 other workhouse employees running to the basement. One of them, a clerk named William Bradford, had the presence of mind to lock the cellar door and send someone for the authorities immediately. Within 2 hours, Thomas Bellingham, the assistant poor law inspector for the district, arrived at the workhouse. Bellingham was a British civil servant, 41 years old, a man who'd seen the worst of the famine's impact on the workhouse system. He'd investigated overcrowding, embezzlement, inadequate medical care. But nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed in that cellar. His official report, filed with the Poor Law Commission on March 19, 1848, provides the most detailed account we have. I'm reading directly from the archive document, now held in the National Archives in Dublin. At approximately 8 o'clock in the evening of March 12, 1848, I entered the sub-basement coal cellar of the Mountmellick Union Workhouse accompanied by 2 constables of the Royal Irish Constabulary and Dr. William Hartnett, the workhouse medical officer. The cellar, measuring approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, was accessed through a concealed door in the storage area beneath the male fever ward. The scene within defies adequate description. Along the walls, 12 human bodies lay in various states of decomposition. A breeding sow, property of the workhouse, had made a nest in the southwest corner where she had recently given birth to 7 piglets. The animal had clearly been feeding on the remains, as evidenced by significant tissue damage to several corpses and the presence of human matter in the animal's pen area. Dr. Hartnett performed a preliminary examination by lantern light. He determined that 4 bodies showed signs of recent death. Estimated within the previous 7-10 days, 5 bodies were in moderate decomposition. Estimated 2-3 weeks post-mortem, 3 bodies were in advanced decomposition. Estimated 4 to 6 weeks post-mortem. All bodies showed evidence of death from typhus fever based on visible post-mortem, rash and characteristic appearance. All bodies appeared to have been simply laid on the coal cellar floor, with no shrouds, coffins, or any attempt at respectful disposition. Several bodies showed evidence of scavenging by the pig, particularly extremities and facial tissue. The cellar showed evidence of regular human access, footprints in the coal dust, a path cleared to the pig's pen, evidence of recent food and water delivery for the animal. Most disturbingly, the arrangement of bodies suggested they had been placed deliberately along the walls to create a pathway to the pig's corner, indicating whoever had been tending the animal had been stepping AR. Found corpses for weeks. I immediately ordered the cellar sealed and posted guards. I sent for additional Poor Law Commission officials and instructed Dr. Hartnett to conduct full post-mortem examinations as soon as possible. The news spread through Mountmellick by morning. A crowd gathered outside the workhouse gates, growing from dozens to hundreds as the day progressed. Father O'Brien arrived early, demanding answers. The families who'd lost loved ones to the isolation ward began to realize what had actually happened to their dead. Mary Delaney collapsed when she understood that her 16-year-old son Patrick had probably been one of those bodies. Catherine Murphy had to be physically restrained from trying to force her way into the building. The Royal Irish Constabulary established a perimeter. 3 additional inspectors arrived from Dublin by March 14th. The Poor Law Commission, facing its worst scandal since the famine began, mobilized its full investigative apparatus. Dr. Hartnett's post-mortem examinations took 3 days. Working in a commandeered stable building with proper ventilation, he documented each body meticulously. His findings were both horrifying and clarifying. All 12 victims had indeed died of typhus fever. There was no evidence of foul play in the deaths themselves. These were people who would have died regardless, given the disease's progression and the medical limitations of 1848. But what had happened after death was an entirely different crime. Dr. Hartnett's report identified the bodies as Patrick Delaney, age 16, died approximately February 5th. Ellen Brennan, age 34, died approximately February 2nd. James Murphy, age 68, died approximately January 30th. Bridget Dunn, age 14, died approximately February 8th. Nora O'Connor, age 71, died approximately January 28th. Joseph Flanagan, age 42, died approximately February 12th. The other 6 bodies were too decomposed for positive identification, but their ages and general descriptions matched other missing inmates. The question that consumed the investigation: why? Why hide dead bodies in a coal cellar with a pig? What possible motive could explain this macabre arrangement? The answer, when it emerged, was as banal as it was horrifying: money. The workhouse system operated on a per capita funding model. Each institution received a set amount per inmate from the Poor Law Commission. Food, clothing, fuel, medical care, all came from this central budget. The more inmates officially registered at the workhouse, the more money it received. But there was a problem. By early 1848, the Mountmellick Workhouse was so overcrowded that it was running a massive deficit. The Board of Guardians had been pressuring Cornelius Dwyer to reduce costs or increase revenue. Dwyer had a choice: either report deaths accurately, which would reduce the official inmate count and therefore reduce funding, or find a way to keep dead inmates alive on paper while eliminating the actual cost of housing and feeding them. He chose the latter. Investigators found the evidence in Dwyer's private ledgers, separate from the official workhouse books. The documents showed that Dwyer had been 1. Recording fever deaths in his private ledger, 2. Not reporting these deaths to the Board of Guardians or the Poor Law Commission, 3. Continuing to claim funding for dead inmates as if they were still alive and receiving care, 4. Hiding the bodies temporarily in the coal cellar to avoid questions about where deceased inmates had gone, 5. Eventually disposing of bodies in unmarked graves in the workhouse cemetery during nighttime burials, claiming they were unclaimed paupers. The pig's presence in the cellar was almost incidental. Dwyer had moved the pregnant sow there because the outdoor pen had become overcrowded, and he wanted to monitor her during farrowing. He'd apparently become so desensitized to the corpse storage that he saw nothing wrong with keeping a valuable farm animal in the AME space. But the financial fraud went even deeper. Investigators discovered that Dwyer had been ordering food and supplies for the full inmate count, including the dead, diverting these excess supplies to the black market, selling them for personal profit, purchasing lower quality food for actual living inmates, with the remaining budget pocketing the difference. The dead weren't just uncounted, they were actively generating profit. Over approximately 8 weeks, Dwyer had hidden the deaths of at least 12 people, possibly more. He'd collected funding for their care while they rotted in a cellar. He'd sold the food meant for their mouths. And he'd fed their flesh, inadvertently, to pigs that would eventually feed the very inmates whose budget he was embezzling. When confronted with the evidence, Cornelius Dwyer showed no remorse. His response, recorded in the investigation transcript, was chilling in its practicality. "What did you expect me to do? Report every death and watch the workhouse collapse financially? We'd have had to turn away hundreds more who needed shelter. I made the hard choice. Someone had to." The investigation into Cornelius Dwyer and the Mountmellick Workhouse scandal rapidly expanded beyond a simple case of financial fraud and corpse concealment. What investigators uncovered was a systemic rot that extended through multiple layers of local governance and exposed deep fissures in how Ireland's famine response was being managed or mismanaged. On March 20, 1848, Cornelius Dwyer was formally arrested and charged with embezzlement, fraud against the Poor Law Commission, and willful and indecent treatment of human remains. His wife, Margaret Dwyer, was also arrested as an accessory, though she would later claim complete ignorance of her husband's activities. The evidence suggested otherwise. Investigators found that Margaret Dwyer, as workhouse matron, had been responsible for recording deaths in the female wards. Her ledgers showed discrepancies similar to her husband's. Inmates who died but remained on official ration lists for weeks afterward. When confronted, she maintained that Cornelius had told her to delay death notifications for administrative efficiency. Whether she understood the full scope of the fraud remained unclear, though investigators noted her convenient naivety strained credibility. The investigation quickly expanded to the Board of Guardians, the local oversight committee that was supposed to provide checks and balances on workhouse management. How had 12 bodies accumulating in a cellar gone unnoticed for 2 months? The answer was depressingly simple. The Guardians had never actually inspected the workhouse thoroughly. Their monthly meetings consisted primarily of reviewing Dwyer's financial reports and rubber-stamping his requests. Several members admitted they'd never even toured the building beyond the administrative offices. Their oversight was entirely theoretical. More troublingly, some Guardians had actively benefited from Dwyer's fraud. The investigation revealed that Cornelius Dwyer had been selling diverted workhouse supplies, food, coal, cloth, to local merchants at below-market rates. 3 of those merchants sat on the Board of Guardians. They'd been purchasing stolen goods from the very institution they were supposed to oversee, then selling those goods at full market price. Sir Richard Mountford, the board chairman and one of the region's largest landlords, claimed ignorance. But investigators discovered that his estate had purchased over 3 tons of coal from Dwyer in January and February 1848 at a 30% discount, coal that had been budgeted to heat the workhouse fever wards. The scandal exploded beyond County Laois. Dublin newspapers seized on the story. The Freeman's Journal ran a front-page headline on March 25th, "Famine Dead Fed to Pigs, Workhouse Master's Scheme Exposed." The Irish Times, typically more sympathetic to British admin, called it an unconscionable breach of every principle of Christian decency and administrative duty. British newspapers picked up the story within days. The Times of London expressed outrage, though notably directed most criticism at Irish corruption rather than systemic failures in British famine relief policy. The Illustrated London News ran an artist's interpretation of the coal cellar scene that sensationalized the horror, showing far more decomposed bodies than actually existed and depicting the pig as an almost demonic creature. The political implications were immediate and explosive. This was March 1848, the year of revolutions across Europe. Ireland's Young Ireland movement was already agitating for rebellion against British rule. The workhouse scandal provided perfect propaganda. Here was concrete evidence of how Britain's relief system was literally treating Irish dead as less than livestock. Young Ireland newspapers like The Nation used the Mountmellick case to argue that the entire workhouse system was designed not to save Irish lives, but to manage Irish death efficiently. They starve us, then warehouse us, then hide our bodies to continue collecting the pennies they dole out for our suffering, one editorial proclaimed. Is this civilization or abattoir management? The British government, already struggling to maintain order in Ireland while European thrones toppled, moved quickly to demonstrate accountability. The Poor Law Commission announced a comprehensive investigation of all Irish workhouses, looking specifically for similar fraud patterns. They wanted to prove Mountmellick was an isolated incident, an aberration caused by one bad actor. They couldn't prove that, because it wasn't true. The expanded investigation conducted between April and August 1848 uncovered disturbing patterns across the Irish workhouse system. 17 workhouses showed evidence of significant delays between inmate deaths and official reporting. 8 workhouses had suspicious discrepancies between inmate counts and supply requisitions. 5 workhouses had missing burial records or graves that couldn't be accounted for. 3 workhouses, including Cork and Kilkenny, had evidence of corpse storage in various locations. Though nothing as egregious as Mountmellick's pig cellar, the problem was systemic. The per capita funding model created perverse incentives. Workhouse masters were rewarded for keeping inmate counts high while being pressured to reduce costs. Death represented lost revenue. The temptation to underreport mortality, even temporarily, was built into the system's architecture. But of all the cases uncovered, Mountmellick remained the most shocking because of its sheer brazenness and the visceral horror of the pig detail. It became the symbol of workhouse system failure. Cornelius Dwyer's trial began on June 15, 1848, at the County Laois Assizes. The prosecution was led by the Crown, reflecting how seriously the government took the political dimensions of the case. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented Dwyer's private ledgers showing systematically unreported deaths, financial records documenting diverted supplies and fraudulent funding, claims testimony from Thomas Kelly, the pig keeper, describing the cellar scene, Dr. Hartnett's post-mortem reports, testimony from 23 family members who'd been lied to about their relatives' deaths, evidence of Dwyer's secret sales of workhouse supplies. Dwyer's defense was handled by a Dublin barrister named Edmund Burke Walsh, who attempted several strategies. First, he tried to argue that Dwyer had been following unofficial but common practices, that other workhouse masters did similar things and Dwyer was being scapegoated. The prosecution countered by noting that even if others had committed fraud, Dwyer's case involved the added element of corpse desecration. Walsh then attempted to argue that Dwyer had been trying to save the workhouse from financial collapse, that his intentions were good even if his methods were questionable. My client faced an impossible situation, Walsh argued. Report deaths accurately and watch hundreds of living inmates suffer from reduced budgets or take extraordinary measures to maintain funding. He chose to protect the living. The prosecution's response was devastating. They brought in Mary Delaney, mother of Patrick, the 16-year-old whose body had been identified in the cellar. She testified about coming to the workhouse day after day, begging for information about her dying son, being turned away, being lied to, and then discovering, months later, that Patrick had been rotting in a coal cellar while pigs were raised around his corpse. Did your client protect the living? The prosecutor asked, gesturing to Mary Delaney. Or did he simply extend their agony by denying them even the comfort of burying their dead with dignity? The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Cornelius Dwyer guilty on all counts. Sentencing occurred 3 days later. The judge, Lord Justice Henry Torrens, delivered a scathing statement before pronouncing sentence. Mr. Dwyer, you have been found guilty of crimes that shock the conscience of civilized society. You were entrusted with the care of Ireland's most vulnerable citizens during their darkest hour. Instead of providing comfort, you treated their deaths as opportunities for profit. You hid their bodies like a criminal hiding evidence of murder. You allowed a farm animal to defile human remains. You lied to grieving families. You stole from the dying. No financial pressure, no administrative difficulty, no organizational challenge can excuse such depravity. You have disgraced not only yourself, but the entire system of poor relief. Cornelius Dwyer was sentenced to 15 years of penal servitude, essentially hard labor in British penal colonies. He was also stripped of all property and ordered to pay restitution to victims' families, though few expected to see any money given that his assets were largely seized by the Crown. Margaret Dwyer, his wife, received a lighter sentence, 3 years imprisonment for accessory to fraud. The judge noted that while evidence suggested her knowledge of the scheme, her level of direct participation remained unclear. But the story didn't end with Dwyer's sentencing. The Board of Guardians of Mountmellick Union was dissolved by government order in August 1848. 5 members, including Sir Richard Mountford, were charged with corruption related to purchasing stolen workhouse supplies. Mountford and 2 others were convicted and fined substantial sums but avoided prison. Their social status protected them from the harsher justice Dwyer faced, a fact not lost on Irish observers who noted that the actual workhouse master was imprisoned, while the landed gentry who'd profited from his crimes paid fines and continued their lives largely unchanged. The workhouse itself underwent complete reorganization. A new master was appointed, along with a new matron, medical officer, and clerk. The Poor Law Commission mandated weekly inspections by external auditors for 2 years. The fever wards were thoroughly cleaned and reorganized. The coal cellar where the bodies had been stored was sealed with bricks, but the damage to public trust was irreparable. Admissions to Mountmellick Workhouse dropped dramatically after the scandal. People chose to take their chances outside, starving in ditches, rather than enter a building now associated with such horror. This created a tragic irony. An institution supposedly designed to save lives during the famine became a place people avoided, even as they died for want of shelter and food. Father O'Brien, the priest who'd first raised concerns, worked tirelessly to identify all the victims. Through careful comparison of his own records, family reports, and workhouse documents, he compiled a list of 21 people he believed had been victimized by Dwyer's scheme. Only 12 bodies had been found in the cellar, meaning 9 others had likely been disposed of in unmarked graves before the scandal broke. On November 1, 1848, All Saints' Day, Father O'Brien conducted a memorial mass for all 21 victims. The identified bodies had been exhumed from the workhouse cemetery and reburied in consecrated ground at Mountmellick's main Catholic church. Family members were finally able to grieve properly. Mary Delaney placed a simple wooden cross on Patrick's grave. It read, "Patrick Delaney, age 16, son of Mary, died February 5, 1848. May he rest in peace." The pig, the sow whose presence in the cellar had catalyzed the discovery, was slaughtered. Her piglets were destroyed. The workhouse board determined that neither could be sold or used for food given the circumstances. They were buried in quicklime. Cornelius Dwyer served 8 years of his 15-year sentence before dying of dysentery in a penal colony in Tasmania in 1856. He was 59 years old. Records indicate he never expressed remorse for his actions, maintaining until his death that he'd been unfairly prosecuted for practices that were common throughout the workhouse system. Margaret Dwyer was released in 1851 after serving her full 3-year sentence. She emigrated to America, settling in Boston where she lived under an assumed name until her death in 1879. A descendant, interviewed by a historian in the 1990s, said the family never spoke of her time in Ireland. As for the broader investigation into Irish workhouses, the findings were quietly shelved by late 1849. By then, Britain was dealing with the aftermath of the failed Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848, and the government had no interest in publicizing systemic failures in famine relief. The Poor Law Commission issued some revised guidelines about death reporting and burial protocols, but no fundamental changes were made to the per capita funding model or oversight mechanisms. The Mountmellick Workhouse continued operating until 1922, when it was converted to other uses following Irish independence. Today, the building houses a local government office complex. The old coal cellar where the bodies were found is now used for storage. A small plaque installed in 1998 during the 150th anniversary of the scandal commemorates the victims. Most locals don't know the building's history. The unmarked graves in the old workhouse cemetery, where Dwyer secretly buried many victims after keeping them alive on paper, were never properly identified or excavated. They remain unknown and unmarked to this day. The Mountmellick Workhouse scandal of 1848 revealed something far more disturbing than one corrupt administrator. It exposed how institutions designed to protect the vulnerable can become mechanisms of exploitation when financial incentives are misaligned with humane objectives. The case remains relevant today because the same structural failures appear again and again across history. The immediate legal impact was minimal but notable. The British Parliament amended the Irish Poor Law in 1849 to require more frequent external audits of workhouse finances and mandatory third-party verification of death records. Workhouse masters could no longer unilaterally report deaths without a doctor's examination and independent documentation. Burial protocols were standardized, requiring family notification and a minimum waiting period before interment. These changes came too late for the estimated 2,500 people who died in Irish workhouses in early 1848, under suspicious circumstances according to the Poor Law Commission's investigation. How many, like Patrick Delaney and the others in Mountmellick's cellar, had their deaths concealed for financial gain? The true number was never established. More significantly, the scandal contributed to a growing international awareness of how Britain was managing, or mismanaging, the Irish Famine. In 1848 and 1849, as news of the workhouse scandal spread across Europe and America, public pressure mounted on the British government to reform its Irish policies. American newspapers, particularly those serving Irish immigrant communities, used the Mountmellick case as evidence of British cruelty. "They treat our dead as livestock," read one editorial in the Boston Pilot, a newspaper serving Irish Catholics in Massachusetts. "Is this how the greatest empire on earth administers Christian charity?" The scandal became a reference point in Irish nationalist rhetoric for the next century. During debates over Irish home rule in the late 19th century, members of Parliament referenced Mountmellick as evidence that British administration in Ireland was fundamentally corrupt. Michael Davitt, founder of the Irish Land League, wrote in 1882, "Remember Mountmellick. Remember how they hit our famine dead with pigs to keep stealing the pennies meant for our survival." This is the administration that claims to govern Ireland for Ireland's benefit, but perhaps the most significant impact was the scandal's role in shaping how we understand institutional failure during humanitarian crises. The Mountmellick case is now studied in courses on public administration, bioethics, and humanitarian policy as an example of how perverse incentives can corrupt even well-intentioned relief systems. The per capita funding model, where institutions receive money based on the number of people they serve, seems logical on its face. But as Mountmellick demonstrated, it creates incentives to inflate numbers, delay reporting departures or deaths, and prioritize appearance over reality. We've seen the same pattern repeat. In the 1990s, several American nursing homes were caught keeping deceased patients on their census rolls to continue collecting Medicare payments. The financial mechanism was different, but the fundamental dynamic was identical to what Cornelius Dwyer did: treat the dead as a revenue source. In 2008, investigations into FEMA's response to Hurricane Katrina revealed that some disaster shelters had significantly inflated their occupancy counts to receive additional federal funding, while actual displaced persons went unserved. In 2015, the United Nations discovered that several refugee camps in Africa had been reporting dramatically inflated populations to increase food aid shipments, which camp administrators then diverted to black markets. The pattern is consistent when institutions are funded based on the number of people they claim to serve, rather than outcomes they achieve. The temptation to manipulate numbers becomes overwhelming. The dead become profitable, suffering becomes currency. The Mountmellick scandal also illuminates something darker about how societies deal with mass death. The workhouse system was designed in part to remove dying poor people from public view. Out of sight, out of mind wasn't just a consequence, it was a feature. The architectural segregation, the isolation wards, the paupers' graves, all of it served to make death tidy, manageable, bureaucratic. Cornelius Dwyer's crime was not inventing this system of managed invisibility. His crime was taking it to its logical conclusion: if we're going to hide these deaths anyway, why not profit from them? This raises uncomfortable questions about our own era. How many deaths in nursing homes, prisons, immigration detention centers, psychiatric facilities go unremarked because they occur in institutions designed to keep suffering invisible? How often do we allow administrative convenience to override human dignity? The families of Mountmellick's victims asked these questions in 1848. Mary Delaney, in a letter to the Freeman's Journal published in April 1848, wrote, "My son Patrick died alone in fever, calling for his mother, who was turned away at the gate. He was thrown in a cellar with pigs, but I am told this happened because of administrative pressures and financial constraints." What kind of civilization uses such words to excuse leaving children to rot? What kind of people are we becoming when we can explain away anything with enough bureaucracy? Her question resonates across nearly 2 centuries. The Mountmellick scandal also demonstrated how corruption flourishes when oversight becomes theatrical rather than substantive. The Board of Guardians held their monthly meetings, reviewed their reports, signed their approvals. They performed oversight without actually overseeing. Everyone followed the script until someone, Thomas Kelly, the pig keeper, accidentally discovered what was hidden in the basement. How many of our own oversight mechanisms are equally performative? How many boards, committees, and regulatory agencies check boxes without actually checking conditions? Finally, the case reveals how quickly we sanitize horror into statistics. In official Poor Law Commission records after 1848, the Mountmellick scandal appears as a brief notation: administrative irregularities discovered, corrective measures implemented. 12 bodies in a coal cellar with a pig become irregularities. The anguish of families denied the right to bury their dead becomes measures. This sanitization serves a purpose. It allows systems to continue functioning without confronting their own capacity for inhumanity. But it also ensures that the lessons of Mountmellick remain unlearned. Ireland has not forgotten, even if official histories have moved on. In 1998, survivors' descendants erected a memorial garden in Mountmellick with the names of all 21 identified victims of Dwyer's scheme. The garden includes a bronze sculpture, a woman kneeling, her hands reaching toward the earth, her face raised to the sky. The inscription reads, "They died in fever and were denied the dignity of proper burial. We remember them, we honor them, we will not let their suffering be buried again." Every year on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, the date Thomas Kelly discovered the cellar, descendants of famine victims gather at the memorial. They read the names, they light candles, they refuse to let administrative language erase what happened. Because what happened at Mountmellick wasn't an administrative irregularity. It was a choice, a series of choices made by individuals who decided that money mattered more than dignity, that convenience mattered more than compassion, that the dead were just numbers in a ledger. And the uncomfortable truth is that those choices are always available. In every era, in every crisis, someone will suggest that extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary measures. Someone will argue that we need to be practical, realistic, efficient. The victims of Mountmellick remind us where that logic leads, to a coal cellar where children's bodies feed pigs while their mothers are turned away at the gate. The Mountmellick workhouse scandal forces us to confront a disturbing question: what drove Cornelius Dwyer to treat dying fever victims as a financial opportunity? Was he uniquely monstrous, or was he simply the product of a system that incentivized exactly the behavior he displayed? I want to hear your thoughts. Leave your theories in the comments below. Do you think Dwyer genuinely believed he was making a hard but necessary choice to keep the workhouse functioning, or was he simply a predator who saw vulnerable people as marks? And what about the Board of Guardians who profited from his scheme? Are they less culpable because they maintained plausible deniability? More broadly, where do you see parallels to the Mountmellick case in our modern institutions? Are there systems today that create the same perverse incentives Dwyer exploited? This is why we do what we do at the Silent Abbey. We excavate these buried stories because they hold mirrors up to our present. The past isn't past. The choices that led to 12 bodies in a cellar are choices that people still face every day in different forms. If you found this deep dive into one of the Irish Famine's darkest chapters compelling, please subscribe to our channel. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. We publish new forgotten horror stories from history every week, and your support helps us continue this work of remembrance. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how quickly institutions can become instruments of exploitation. Tag them in the comments. Let's build a community that refuses to forget these lessons. Next week, we're investigating the Eddyville poorhouse incident of 1893. When inspectors in Kentucky discovered something that made the Mountmellick scandal look almost restrained by comparison. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember the names: Patrick Delaney, Ellen Brennan, James Murphy, Bridget Dunn, Nora O'Connor, Joseph Flanagan, and the 15 others whose names we'll never know for certain. They were treated as numbers. We remember them as people. See you in the next video.